You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Cynthia Toolin-Wilson, and I'm here on my show, Author to Author, with Kathryn Anne Casey. She's written an interesting book called What God Has Emptied and How I Found Hope in Their Diagnoses. How are you today, Kathryn?
I'm doing well. How are you, Cynthia?
I'm fine, thank you. A little chilly up here in Vermont, but other than that, I'm okay.
That is so hard for me to believe coming from California.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. Well, would you start us with prayer and then we'll jump right into the book?
Yes. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we thank you so much for bringing us together today. Thank you for the opportunity to bring this project to the public, to those who may need to hear these words. I thank you for this opportunity to speak with Cynthia and to share about this book and the work that you did in my life and the life of my family. Please be with us today and all those who may be listening. Amen.
Amen. So that's a very interesting title, and I'm wondering what it is that had led you to write the book and how you selected that particular title.
Thank you. So the book itself is a memoir. It's just a straight telling of about a 2-year period from the day that I found out I was pregnant with my 4th child, Peter, until about 5 months after the death of my daughter, Celeste. And in that time, when I was pregnant with Peter, he was diagnosed with a cleft lip and palate, which the midwife told me that day that they saw that on the ultrasound. As far as birth defects, as far as prenatal diagnoses go, that's one of the easier ones because it's a few surgeries and then it's fixed, which to my mind, having had only healthy births, I had had a couple miscarriages, but I hadn't experienced anything medical with my children at all. That was just earth-shattering for me. And then when he was born, he failed to thrive. So after about 2 months, he was actually below his birth weight when he was 2 months old, and he was hospitalized. And he's in and out of the hospital. And after he was probably, I want to say 6 months old, I found out I was pregnant again. And my daughter, who I was pregnant with at that time, at her 20-week ultrasound, we learned that she had anencephaly, which meant that she was alive, but she was developing without a brain. That there was a birth defect that caused that to happen, and that she would die during or soon after her birth. But she would continue to live inside me because of the incredible ways that pregnancy works. And so the book follows this time period of incredible intensity and incredible prayer until about a few months after Celeste was born and died during birth. So when I was going through all of that, I was living at the hospital in San Francisco at UCSF, and my family lives on a good day about 2 hours away. It all depends on the traffic because everyone's going to San Francisco.
Sure.
So I have, as I said, Peter was my 4th child. So I had 3 kids at home and my husband, and I was living apart from them in and out of the hospital with Peter, sometimes up to 6 weeks at a time. And that lasted for about 1.5 years that he was hospitalized frequently. So I did a lot of reading. And one of the books that I encountered probably after that first year is Come Be My Light, which is the words from Mother Teresa that specifically talk about that darkness that she experienced. A priest had recommended this book to me. And in it, in one of the margins, and I can't remember if it was a letter or a diary, she wrote a quote from someone else that said, there would come a time when God would fill what he had emptied.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was away from home, because I was experiencing not only what felt like the impending death of my child, even though she was with me and she was alive because I was still pregnant with her, and the fear of what would happen with Peter, and a lot of other things happened as well. And it felt like God was emptying us out.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew that God was good.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the solid foundation from my youth, from my young adulthood. And so I believed that God was good. And this quote for me really captured that hope,
Mm-hmm.
that there would come a time that God would fill what he had emptied.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's where the title comes from. And that's kind of the overview of what happened, what the book shares with the reader.
That sounds like the worst possible circumstances a person could be in. That's I can't even believe how hard that would be. Wow.
Yeah.
That's I guess that's about as bad as it gets.
It definitely felt that way. Now, One of the things that I learned from all that is, I don't know where this expression comes from, but it makes me, I know that I've been reading Saint Therese for a long time. Saint Therese of Lisieux was my confirmation saint, and Story of the Soul, still have that original copy that I kept. And there's that story that she shares when her sister, I think she's asking about God's grace or holiness, but her sister tells her to get a little cup and a large cup, and she fills them both to the brim.
Mm-hmm.
And that helps Therese understand that God can fill great, magnificent souls to the brim, or he can even little souls. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I learned about suffering in all this is this expression, a full cup is a full cup.
Yeah.
So while my circumstances may sound just frightening, really terrible, at the same time, when anyone is suffering, they're suffering.
Yeah.
And sometimes people can feel like, oh, what I'm going through is nothing compared to that. And that may either motivate them to keep a perspective of hope and of looking at the gifts that are in their life. But sometimes it can make people feel like they shouldn't talk about what they're suffering. But if we're hurting, there is so much goodness to seeking out support, resources of hope, scripture verses, the writings of the saints, spiritual counsel, therapy. There's so many resources that we can seek out when we recognize just those words, I am suffering.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever used the word suffering. And I've had some bad times. My first husband died of cancer, literally in my arms. One of my granddaughters died. I eventually remarried and my stepdaughter died. So I understand, although these were adults, it's a whole different story when you're dealing with babies. But these were adults who had lived and enjoyed life. But, I've never thought of it as suffering as much as just the word I use is heartbreaking. It's like something is just broken inside of you, and I actually physically feel it while I'm going through it. But with babies, that's really, that really is heartbreaking.
I mean, there's definitely something to, because when they're so little, they're so dependent on us.
Yes.
And we haven't separated from them at all. I know that when after my daughter Celeste had died, the feeling of she's supposed to be with me. or as women are when we are pregnant with a child, our body orients towards knowing that child's movements. And so there's that break that happens. So while I think that there is something to, I mean, there's the heartache of a lost life also, like you pointed out about they were able to enjoy life. And so we ache for what they're not able to experience.
Yes.
But a part of me still feels like that it's a different type of grief.
Yeah, it is.
And one thing I learned, so Peter is alive and well. Peter is stable, and he has a chronic illness. He has a hidden disability due to a genetic condition, which we learned about in the hospital. But I'm afraid I lost my train of thought there.
Well, it is different when it's children.
Yeah.
And it's not just, I think, the dependence, which is that, but it's the innocence, and I think it's the fact that they haven't had a chance to even start very far before things are over. Although the one thing that has given me hope, when my one of my granddaughters died, and then later when my stepdaughter died, who was an adult, but it's they are with God, and so we know that at some point, assuming we live properly and are in love with God, that we will see them again, and that's something that I think people, they know it, but I don't think they really dwell on it. It's like, to me, it's almost like heaven as reunion.
Yeah. And I think that as a society, we're very removed from death, the way that culture in the United States is. Yeah. And so when we experience the death of a child, when we experience death early on in life, and I know a lot of other mothers who've experienced miscarriage and I experienced this with my first miscarriage. It gives us this awareness of heaven, just what you're talking about. Yeah. This sense, the bigger picture.
Yes.
That we have from the moment of conception until eternity. And that what we do on earth now has that view, that eternal view, instead of just what's happening right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And to some extent, I think that's one of the things God has given us so we can survive tragedy like that.
Yeah. And that's where I think the word suffering can actually help frame it, because we talk about the saints who suffered. We talk about maybe the suffering souls in purgatory.
Sure.
But one of the things that I really held on to is the image of Our Lady, of our sorrowful mother. And with her, we have the promise of the Assumption. So we have, Christ, the merits of Christ's death and resurrection applied to her before he's born, right? Beforehand, in her Immaculate Conception. So we also see the promise of him coming again and the resurrection of the dead in her Assumption. And so everything that we go through, whatever suffering, whatever heartbreak we go through, there's meaning in it. And there's hope in it. Because God has a plan to bring good out of this thing that has happened when we open our hearts to him. And I think that really is, I hope, the core message of this book.
I like the way you phrase it as, it's teaching us something. And that's something that people could hang on to if they ever thought that way. But I don't think I've ever, I think you're right, but I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that before. In relationship to death of someone, whether prematurely or even if they were older. that it does teach you something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, when my husband died, it was one of the most significant moments of my life. And it taught me something so enormous because, and I guess I had never actually thought of it in that term, but when he died, I knew he had left the room, but that he had not ended. And I had such a powerful sense of that. It was as if Jesus had come in. I didn't see him or, anything like that, but it was as if what happened was that he came in and took him home with him. And I was able, it was a painful time in my life, of course, but it helped me survive that. I wouldn't say easily, but relatively easily, because I knew he wasn't ending like just going poof. He was somewhere else. I had that sense of him continuing.
Mm-hmm.
And, so I think that expression of it teaches you something is really an important one. I guess I'm pretty sure that we don't all learn the same thing from it, but we do learn, and it's not that we investigate it and find it. It's that it's something that is taught to us.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good insight.
And I love what you said about, I think it's an important point too, that we're if we go through these experiences, if we go through the experience of grief, that there are different lessons that we need to take from that.
Yeah.
Because God knows what we need. He knows what lesson will speak to our heart and give us that, because we're looking for an answer, right? In suffering.
Yeah.
It's the problem of suffering, right? There's always those questions about it. And while there might be the abstract, theological, philosophical answers to the problem of suffering, God is personal. And so when we suffer, we're seeking a personal answer that is for me, that will speak to my heart and help me find a way forward in this world that is hard to live in.
Yeah. And I think the most common question would be why. We all know we're going to die. We all know the people around us are going to die. But when it comes to the time, even though we know that's going to happen at some point, it's like, why? And, I think that's another important point, whether you're dealing with someone who's, miscarried, or someone who's very young, or someone who's very old. It's like we all face that, and it's difficult, and we do ask that question, even if we don't verbalize it, we do ask it. And God certainly supports us with an answer if we're open.
It's interesting with that, because when we were, there was a moment when, okay, if you're ready, Peter had been in the hospital. My husband's brother died. Oh. My husband broke his foot, and I was pregnant, and we found out that Peter's condition was genetic, and that any child I had a 1 in 4 chance of having that condition. So I'm sitting there pregnant with a child, wondering if we're going to be doing this with a second child, because now I know that this is a possibility. And we're faithful Catholics. We never considered terminating that pregnancy. We never considered that. So there's a whole conversation around that as well. But so I contacted a priest I had known since I was in 3rd grade. And he's a priest who has kind of just been there at these important moments in my life. It's interesting to see how he's just always kind of been there. He's not always been in this country, but there's always been a connection, whether to my family or to myself. So I talked with him on the phone, and I told him what was happening. And he said to me, He said, we can't know why this is happening, but all you can do is hold on for dear life.
Mm.
And for myself, I want to know the answers. I want to know the reasons. I want to know how it all works and what to expect next. And very like excuse me, into the method, you know, the approach and all that. Mm-hmm. So I personally needed to hear that. I'm not going to find an answer. Why? That answer might reveal itself in time.
Yeah, it does usually.
And as I'm going through it, it's okay not to know why. Mm-hmm. I needed to hear that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I say that we ask why, I think, you know, because God doesn't dispense answers on requests like that. But I think when we say why, or we think why, what happens is that we learn more trust, because we know at some point the answer will be there in some form, you know, and that's always kind of upheld me.
Yes.
You know, so at some point I'll understand. Might be 30 years from now, but it's okay. God does things in his own time. But yeah. So,
and I think for myself at that time, I don't know that. So Peter is now, he's 6 years old. Mm-hmm. And I'm only now starting to understand kind of the bigger picture in the life we're living right now. Not so much the eternal, but like the life right now of how God works these things. Like, you know, how God will do something in my life in order to bring about something for my children. I'm just now learning that because they're only now getting old, you know, old enough for me to be able, I have an 11-year-old. I'm starting to see that as her own separate life is emerging.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm starting to see that picture in the life we live. So I don't know that I really even understood that you can see the reason for things like in this life. And maybe, you know, I'm sure there's some people where they may not get, you know, they may not feel like they're getting a break for a long time of what's happening. You know, it's more comfortable here in the United States, but all around the world. And whether it's health issues or instability, war, there's a lot of people that maybe in this life, they may not get a full satisfying answer, but that trust, that's the faith, the trust that comes in.
Yeah. We've taught here at Holy Apostles where I work. We have taught Eritreans some theology and philosophy, and this is very, very strong tyranny. They do speak English, and so that obviously was necessary for us to be able to teach them. But I became friendly with some of them over time, you know, because we were teaching online. And one of them said to me one day, you know, would you pray for my sister? And I said, yes, what's wrong? And he said, well, she's going to try to get across the border and get into Sudan so she can have a better life. And I just sat there thinking, Sudan is a better life for these people. You know, so I think, you know, part of what God does when we have our own sufferings is I think he gives us a more tender heart for the people who are suffering, perhaps in 100% different ways.
Yeah.
You know, I never forgot that. And then the same group, you know, I spoke to one of my coworkers and I said, you know, this sister hasn't handed in her homework in a couple of weeks. I hate to flunk her, you know. And the reply I get is, well, let's wait and see if she's been killed. She had not been. Something had happened in her convent. But it's like once you're open to learning that sort of stuff, it amazes me how much of it you will see, and how you respond internally, and how that, sometimes that helps other people.
I think there's something really beautiful to that, because when you have gone through suffering, you mentioned this earlier, like it makes you more tender-hearted. They think because we have this different view of life, when we've experienced something, and I do believe we all come to some suffer. If our hearts are open to others, at some point our hearts will break, right? That is part of love, is that openness to giving of self-gift, of giving yourself to others. So when a person has suffered and then they read or they hear about someone else's suffering, and especially in a personal conversation and hearing someone's story and reading a memoir, we have that gift of hearing, I'm not alone. I'm not alone. And beyond even that, I am connected to a community of those who have also been through this darkness, seen light on the other side. Because it can feel very isolating.
Because it's happening to you. It's not like it's something that's happening to an entire community around you. Even though, as you say, there is a community of people who have been through the same thing. But because it is happening to you, and you're thinking about it inside of you, it does seem isolating. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important, not only, of course, that we take it to God in prayer, but also that we're open with family and friends, because that reduces the feeling of isolation, even though ultimately you are the person going through it. But it helps. Yeah.
And it's hard. It can be really hard to know who is it. How much do you share? Because I find that, especially with our story, because I am part of a community of a lot of other mothers, my story some women will want to, they're afraid to think of it. They're afraid to imagine that kind of suffering. So then what can end up happening is, when a woman is experiencing miscarriage or a health issue with their child or a developmental issue with their child, even in a Catholic circle, it can be really hard to know who to turn to and who will be able to receive that vulnerability in a safe way. So the more that we can talk about these things, at an appropriate level, right? But the more we can talk about them, the more that when people encounter, whether it's the death of their spouse or their child, their grandchild, they know there is someone they can turn to.
So communication, obviously through prayer with God, but communicating with God, waiting for an answer, which sometimes he initiates that conversation, or opening it with other people, is really important, because by our very nature, we are social. We are communal, and it's important for others. I'd almost say for others to help you bear through bad times. And then in return, if something happens, you're there for them. But a suffering done in isolation is not usually very fruitful.
Right. And that's where I feel like the Lord does everything he can to show us that. He even has, he has someone help him carry the cross. He has Mary and John at the foot of the cross. Like he shows us that it is not good for man to be alone.
That's right.
And what you were saying reminds me of one of the earliest conversations I had with one of Peter's doctors, where he had been in the hospital for 11 days and then he gained a little bit of weight. So we went home and we had a follow-up 1 week later. And at that follow-up appointment, you just meet with whoever was the attending doctor when you were in the hospital, whoever was in charge of that specialty. So we went to that appointment and I have spreadsheets with all, like, everything I could document from that week. And he hadn't gained any weight while he had been home. And so she knows this means we got to go back in. She hasn't said that to me yet. But what she says to me instead is that you have done this shows that you are doing everything you can to help him. Let us help you carry this.
Wow.
And so I trusted her. And she is really the doctor who was probably the most instrumental in saving his life.
Wow.
So,
boy, now that's a real blessing. You know, to end up with someone like that. You know, that's really wonderful.
So that's just one of the stories. There's more. There's so many. It's amazing to look back and realize all these moments and to see there's so much good that God brought out of this. There was so much suffering, but there were so many connections. There's so much learned. The way I remember them talking about as a refiner's fire, right? The way that love in our household has changed because some things aren't worth our tears. That there's, I don't know, just learning to value what we have and to just be grateful for the most ordinary irritations. Those can be gifts.
Don't feel like it at the time, though, do they?
Oh, no.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. But it's funny because no matter how much you learn that through life, you know, that some of these little annoyances, or sometimes they're big annoyances, big problems, you know, can be good in the long run. They can help you do something or learn something. But when it happens, it's like, you know, it's never, so God, what are you trying to teach me here?
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
Well, I homeschool my
nature.
Kids. Yeah. I homeschool my kids, so I feel like I'm encountering this multiple times every day.
Yeah.
But I think, we have to keep relearning that lesson. We have to keep relearning. Okay, what did I learn a few years ago? What was that lesson? What was that thing that someone told me? What was that? I used to know this.
Yeah.
We have to keep revisiting it. But every time we revisit, we grow in whatever that virtue is.
Yeah, that's true. Fortunately, God has a sense of humor.
Oh, yeah.
But, or anyway, I'm hoping so. But, yeah, I mean, you know, it's living life is really a series of, to a great extent, a series of experiences from which you can or cannot learn, depending on how open you are. And I think, you know, you're still young, but as you get older, the things change, you know, and it just, you know, when things change and you have to learn something new, like, you know, that I can no longer walk 5 miles, you know, and that's like at 72. But I think that if we're open to that, again, over time, there's never going to come a time in this life where we say, okay, I've learned everything I need to learn. I've learned everything God wants me to learn. That does not happen.
Yeah.
So it's great though,
And that points to one of the core lessons that I learned came from the book Searching for and Maintaining Peace by Father Jacques Philippe.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually talk about this a lot in another book that I've written called Peace in Pregnancy. But this idea that in order to accept the will of God, in order to have peace,
mm-hmm.
that means a radical acceptance of what is in front of us, that God has allowed us to be here.
Mm-hmm.
And what does God have for me here? It's
mm-hmm.
not to say that the situation's okay, especially if the badness of the situation has to do with what someone is doing to me.
Mm-hmm.
But it means that God has something for me here to do
mm-hmm.
or to learn or to, find meaning in. God has
mm-hmm.
something for me here. And
mm-hmm.
that openness, that belief
mm-hmm.
is the way to peace.
Yeah, it is. Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah. And as we get, as we go through life, accepting that, if we can accept that, it's better for us.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, when I think of age, because I'm old, obviously, but when I think of age, it's like the limitations, but there's also so many opportunities that you have that you didn't have before. I mean, I never would have thought of, of the peaceful times you have, the time alone you have to really think without saying, gee, I've got to jump up and make dinner for 5.
Mm-hmm.
So there are blessings that come, but it is a matter of accepting them, because I think a lot of times people are just, they're resentful that life has changed.
Mm-hmm.
We're not always in our prime. Just a little warning for you.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of this. I've heard of this idea before.
Yeah, it's true.
So I have birthed 6 babies. So I'm starting to learn how things change.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's no models for this in our culture right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's how to grow older, how to embrace that.
Mm-hmm.
So much of our culture is trying to fight against it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Facelifts, liposuction. But it's also, it's like people will come up to you and say, well, when are you going to retire? And it's like, well, what am I going to do then? And I'm sure, I've heard of younger people where people see something that other people will see something they don't like, and they'll say something like, don't you think you have enough kids? So it's like there's that kind of interference in life. But yeah, so I'll have people say, well, when are you going to retire? I want to make sure you're able to enjoy the rest of your life. And it's like, I enjoy my life just fine.
Yeah.
But things do change. And I think part of the peace that God gives us is to be able to deal with that comfortably. Of course, the kind of situation that you're talking about, certainly God gives you graces, but I don't know how comfortable you can be in this situation with babies. It's like that's hard because it's someone else's life, as opposed to somebody in your own. But yeah, so you have fun things to look forward to. Just remember me when someone comes up to you when you're like 60 and says, when are you going to retire? You can't do the work anymore, and you're doing more work than them.
My husband and I always say we're actually looking forward to the time when we can work more because he's a church organist, and he's a musician. And when he teaches, because he teaches music, he teaches from a studio at home. And I'm writing, and I'm working for a newspaper, but we're, we take turns with the kids and all that. So yeah, I'm with you, Cynthia. Just because, then we're called to find, I don't know, moments of joy, moments of beauty where we can get them. And that's something that also comes up in the book, because I was living there. And after, I'm trying to think of when it was. So there's the first 11-day admission, and then we went back for 6 weeks. Oh. And during that time, I think the staff started to worry about me, because I left. First, he was in the ICU, and then he moved to the unit it's sort of in between ICU and the regular floor. So they can monitor more, but you're not home free. So I was desperate to see my kids, and I had never been this long apart from them. I didn't want to ask them. I actually think this was the first admission. I didn't want to ask everyone to make the sacrifice to bring my kids in case we were going to go home the next day. I just didn't know how to cope. And when they told us we were going to stay a few more days, I think I fell apart, and I was sobbing. And a social worker came in to talk to me and was just like, I think you really need to just go out for a walk.
Yeah.
Something so simple, to go out for a walk. And those walks became this lifeline, this core part of my experience, because every day when Peter would go down for a nap, I would go out for my walk. And I was in San Francisco, and it's UCSF. So it's basically all hospital for quite a distance, but then there are these little neighborhoods nearby. It's a pretty safe area. And I would explore, and I would go into little shops, and I would buy something, and I would just feel normal. And then there's a lot of beauty in that city, because I come from what is essentially desert. It's agricultural, but it's desert. There's nothing grows without water, and there's no water coming from the sky. But there, these beautiful flowers grow up out of the sidewalk. And I would just delight in all that. And then when I came back to the hospital room after my hour out, maybe another social worker would come in and check on us and just make sure we're doing okay. And there was one in particular, she would just always ask me, like, so where'd you walk today? And we would talk about something that wasn't the hospital, that wasn't Peter. Yes. And I was able to feel human.
Yeah, you kept your sanity through something like that, or it helped you keep your sanity. That might be too strong of a saying, but the thing is, you do need some normalcy, and, you also need, you can't give what you don't have. And if you just give, you've got to get something back. That little walk that gives you a little fresh air, a change of scenery really probably helped you enormously.
It did, in every way. And now that Peter's stable, when we go back to San Francisco, I experienced this renewal. Like I go back to the place where I was desperately dependent on God. Because I was essentially alone, because he was a baby, and I'm not, not getting anything from him. And my husband was home, and my kids were here, and so I was alone. And so I was with God. I was alone with God, and where I had incredible support from the hospital team. It was amazing, the support that I had from the hospital. And where they saved his life, where they brought him back to be able to thrive and be the kid that he is today. So, but a lot of it is those walks. A lot of it is that I knew in order to cope, I had to be able to step away.
Yeah.
And
You have
not
to,
let it.
yeah, you have to take care of yourself too,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can take care of others.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you'd step away. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh no, it's just step away and
Mm-hmm.
Be renewed or feel normal or develop different interests even.
Mm-hmm.
I had little coping things, like I would try to learn a new medical word every day.
Okay, that's a new one on me. Yeah, I crochet. Um, I think I started when I was about 6 years old, and now whenever somebody says to me, why are you crocheting, and I kiddingly say, I crochet because murder is wrong. So obviously it's not that bad. Well, I kid with people. It's like, this is my way of stressing that repetitive motion with fabric, or yarn, the kinds of needlework that many women love. And so it's like, nope, I'm crocheting, but it's true. We do need to have that. We need to have that break, not in the sense that you want to get away from the situation, but if you don't take something in, you're not going to have anything left to give. You need to have that little break, so yeah. It's I don't know if men are the same, but women I've spoken to, and many women are the ones who bear the problems, or the tragedies or misfortunes. They're the ones who handle them. And I've heard over and over, the need to take that little break because it refreshes you.
Yeah. Well, I think as human beings, that we have these different dimensions to who we are.
Yeah, yeah.
I studied at Divine Mercy University, where we talk about, these different dimensions of the human person, where we're relational, we have free will, we have our intellectual capacity, we're bodily, so we have the emotions, and we're going to, this is going to be emphasized in different varying levels. So for women, right, because our bodies are always changing, we have more emotions. But I think that for any person, male or female, in difficult times, if we can exercise those other elements. So if the relationship, like in a season of young parenthood, or when someone is ill and you are pouring everything out, that relational part of you is being exercised constantly. Being able to step back and maybe do something intellectual, learn something new, as we talked about, or creating something, doing something physical. I think for my husband, because he had a whole different experience being home with the children, and that was not his area of expertise, or that was not his first choice of what he would be doing with his, his days as being a single dad. For him, being able to create something, being able to build something. They did this elaborate slide for the little Hot Wheels cars in the backyard. He would do things like that, do something physical. Or he would create something like a video on the computer. Things like that helped enrich him. And then it does that. It fills our cup to be able to go back to the thing we're called, the duty that we have.
Yeah, I agree. It's that little, I like that idea of the different dimensions, that it's almost like you wear one out if it's the only one you're using in a crisis. You need variety. You need to, get away from too much stress for a few minutes or something. So, so how are all of your children at this point?
Oh, they're good. We had a little adventure yesterday where we went to the coast, and we're about 2.5 hours from the Santa Cruz area where you have beach.
Okay.
And then about 15 minutes from there, you have the California redwoods.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just an incredible, it's exquisite area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we went there yesterday. But so as I said, my oldest is 11 and then down to the 2-year-old. So we had another child after Celeste and she was God's gift to us. Because we needed her in ways we didn't even know. We needed that, her presence in our life. So they're all doing really well.
That's great.
I feel like we entered into this time of peace and where there's not a lot happening. We have a lot of little emergencies here, but they're not the big ones. So, we're just taking every day as that gift. And I don't do it perfectly. I do not do it perfectly, but it's there and it's beautiful. So
good. Yeah. It's, it's good when you can have the normalcy. There's a lot to be said for normalcy, the routine. Even if part of the routine is to go out and do something every once in a while, I think that we live on that cycle, like the 7-day cycle, or, where you know exactly what you're going to do on Sunday, that sort of thing. But I'm glad to hear that everything is going well because clearly, you've had a rough time there for a while.
Yeah, it is. I wonder at it. I look back and I see it was these 2 years. It was these 2 years where it was really hard. Like I said, we never had anything medical happen before, to where doctors were in our lives. Like my other kids are remarkably healthy. It's strange to me. To look at that because I don't take it for granted anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's this time of building. And I think for myself personally, I'm working to take what I learned in those extreme circumstances and learn how to apply them to the mundane, the everyday. And that's actually really hard.
Yeah, I understand. But, life is, it has its ups and downs. No two ways about it. When my husband had a bad back, my first husband had a very bad back. And he called me. I was at a quilt show. He called me and he said, I have a bad backache. So he went, I said, well, go to the emergency room because I was up here in Vermont. And at the time we lived in Connecticut. And he did, and they just diagnosed him as having strained his back. And turned out it was actually esophageal cancer, that it was already all the way through his body, but they didn't find it. So it's like the most mundane things you do, like I go to a quilt show or, and then you get a call that, your husband doesn't feel good. And I said, well, do you want me to come home? He's like, oh, no, I'm fine. It's just my bad back. And, there's always, nothing ever stays the same permanently. And it's a talent which I have not yet found or been given, where I can determine when something looks out of the way it should be, to realize how serious something is. I mean, it struck me as so odd that a man who has a bad back would call me because he had a really bad backache and that it was already stage 4 cancer. It's, any more than you having a child and all of a sudden you're discovering these problems. It's where the routine is just blown out the window. So, but with God's grace, we survive and thrive.
Amen.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the other book you wrote, would you be interested in being interviewed on that at some point?
Yes, I'd love to. I actually have two other books.
Oh.
The first one is called Journey in Love,
Mm-hmm.
Catholic Mother's Prayers After Prenatal Diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. That
book is a devotional to help support women who have either through testing or the ultrasound found that there is some birth defect, there's a diagnosis the child's received, and it may be life-limiting, it may not. I've been through both. So to walk with women on that path. And then the second one I mentioned already, Peace in Pregnancy, is another devotional for women in any circumstance who are pregnant, whether it's their first or their 10th child. So yeah, I'd love to share more about those.
Good. I'll see if Sebastian can set something up for us.
All right.
Okay. Was there anything else that you wanted to say before we close?
I'm so grateful for this opportunity to be able to share this story with people because so often it's like you just get the barest snippets of a story. And I think that the strength of a memoir is being able to invite someone to walk with you and to see more of those details. So it's not something we don't have a lot of memoir in Catholic publishing. I know NROUT's been really great about publishing more of those stories. And so I think sometimes just the big, wild stories get published. And you read about extraordinary people living their ordinary circumstances. But I think there's strength to just an ordinary person who was just living life, raising kids, homeschooling, then put into something that is very different than ordinary life. So I think that's really the beauty of memoir in this medium.
Yeah, I am a memoirist also. I wrote one book, which I haven't published yet, about 3 pro-life stories. Of course, Vermont is a physician-assisted suicide state. So I address some of those issues from things that I've seen or heard or witnessed here. But the book that I did just publish with En route is that, it's the story of my mother trying to abort me in 1949 chemically, and how she told me that when I was 11, and how that affected my life. It is strongly pro-life, and I've had people read it and they say, I really can't do this. It's too tough. It's like, thank you. That's my life. But anyway, it strikes me as funny because I came out on the other end okay, and it's like, well, I can't read this. This is tough. It's okay. I lived it. But anyway, thank God gave me humor.
That's how you know he has a sense of humor.
Oh yeah,
we can look at it and laugh.
Yeah. One of the reasons I wrote it was to point out, I had terrible physical, I had to have facial reconstruction. And the joints on the left side of my body don't work right. They're smaller than the other side. So I kind of walk with a funny gait. But, to me, the whole point of one of the points of the story is that people think all of a sudden abortion bloomed on the scene with Roe v. Wade. 1949 was a long time before Roe v. Wade. And, people were regularly using, abortifacients. And if they were lucky, they got it out of a druggist like my mother did. But, it's like, this is not a new problem, so it's really something that needs to be addressed because it's so disordered. that all the way back then and way before then, because I've read some social histories about abortion going into like the 1800s. And it was like people were going out of their way, you know. I mean, they would have abortions any way that they could, you know, because, you know. And so that's part of the story is just that it's important to realize this isn't something new. This is a problem as far back as there's been pregnancy, you know. So, you know, people really need to address, why are women willing to do this, you know, and, you know, what can be done to make them see an alternative, you know. I mean, saying to someone, well, you should be pro-life is really not going to do it. It might make them think, but so anyway, I like memoir for, to some extent, I think it's the best way that you can tell a story. You know, it's probably a more convincing way of getting people to understand a situation, not necessarily a personal one, but one that is shared by many people.
Yes.
Yeah. You
because
know,
we're relational, like we were talking about. We're relational. And when you read that intimate story of someone sharing about his or her own life, you connect with them. And it's so important because the examples that are used, especially right now with the media heat over Dobbs, is that they're bringing up these extreme circumstances. I fell into a conversation with a woman who was part of the feminist movement, you know, or last century. And she was saying, like, how can the church say that I would be like being a prisoner of my own body if I had to carry a baby in these circumstances. I won't repeat all the details that she was saying, but I just thought, gosh, like, people would think the same thing about me, because I knew my daughter. I knew what was coming. I knew that she would not live long. Now, a child with anencephaly can live an hour. It's even a few days. It's possible. But usually, most cases, not for very long. And it was really hard. But I needed to hear the things that I heard from the church and from different sources within the church, that carrying her, that continuing her life as long as I could, within reason in this circumstance, was the good that I could do for her as a mother. And so when you just paint this picture of that would be so terrible to make a woman carry a baby in this situation, you say, well, actually, it's not all, there's more to it than you realize. Let me tell you this story. That's the power of memoir.
It's definitely true. I was actually thinking that when you were telling me the story. I mean, you gave her life for as long as she could have it, you know, here. And that's just a humongous gift, regardless of any sacrifice you had to make or your family had to make. In the end, you gave her life as long as she could have it here. That's truly beautiful.
And I thank God for the church's clear teachings on that, because the moment we said we're not willing to terminate, the doctor immediately started talking about early induction. And no one had ever talked about that before. I hadn't heard about that. And I asked, well, how early? And she said, as early as you want, even today. And I thought, well, that seems too much like abortion, but maybe after viability. So that is not what the church teaches. And so unless there is a risk, a health risk to the child or to the mother, and there are particular cases, but that wasn't my case. My body was healthy, and my daughter was alive. And so in cases of anencephaly, it's not morally permissible to induce before the child is full term. So the church had that wisdom, but I didn't know that. And I actually just wrote an article for The Pillar about an organization that helps create this awareness. It's called Be Not Afraid. And they help women who've had a prenatal diagnosis to understand that they can have a birth plan, that there are other options for them, and help them be able to navigate the pain of that situation. To know that there's another way, because a lot of times the medical establishment or people with misguided, they have good intentions, but they're misguided, are saying, well, the baby's going to die anyway. You should just do this. Save yourself some suffering.
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised to hear that. That's, the culture we live in. It's sad. Anyway. So, I think our time is about up. Would you, would you like to close us in a prayer?
All right. Okay. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, I thank you so much for this time, for the opportunity to talk about your presence in the midst of suffering, the hope in the midst of suffering, and the meaning and purpose that we can find in those difficult moments. Thank you so much for this opportunity and for the little reminders in this conversation of the path that you have for us and your goodness in leading us on it. We pray that you would continue to bless us and to help us to trust you. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, well, thank you very much for the interview. I'd like to interview you on the other two books also. I think you've got important messages.
Thank you, Cynthia.
And and hopefully many people will benefit.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a good night.
You too.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.